back to the International Climate Webinar Series interviews. Our guest today is a proven pioneer in digital markets and the leader driving the fintech technology toward net zero. He has nearly 3 decades of expertise in electronic trading, having successfully co-founded Europe's largest exchanges, Europe. Today, he is the chairman and CEO of GMEX Group and the climate fintech platform as a service 013, which was recognized at COP28 for its innovative use of blockchain to scale climate finance and named the world best exchange for ESG 20. Regular speaker at high-profile global forums from Davos. He is the intersection of a cutting-edge digital transformation. Please welcome with me here under me. What's the most valuable non-technical lesson learned building CHIEX that you know in 013?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting because when you create a trading venue or an exchange or any kind of platform that attracts liquidity, the key is liquidity itself, but also connectivity and distribution, because ultimately you have to make it easy for buyers and sellers. And there also needs to be a regulatory driver and an economic driver for these things to work. It's no different when we did this in CHIEX. You had the MiFID regulations in Europe. But when we then look to net zero, you've got Article 6 and aspects of that with Article 6.2 and 6.4 around carbon credits. And there's a broader opportunity around water, energy, and food security.
What is the biggest constant you think that decade in climate fintech?
Technology and more technology as an enabler. We're at an exciting time in a climate sense because there's a convergence of technologies that are really, really useful in that drive to net zero. You know, we have blockchain and certainly a lot of the work is done to address greenwashing and double counting with some of the things that we do and tokenizing assets. But at the same time, you have Internet of Things, you have AI and quantum computing. A lot's been made of the carbon footprint of some of these technologies, but there can certainly be decarbonization and carbon. The technological age we're in is going to encourage source to sale provenance, trust and integrity, which is going to increase liquidity in carbon markets and also accelerate the drive to net zero.
We see that you are a very active expert traveling. What is your one essential sharp for this high profile event?
Yeah, I mean, some people often ask me, why don't I suffer from jet lag? Because, you know, you're often in different parts of the world. And the key to acclimatize is whatever time zone you're in, don't sleep until it's time to sleep. You know, you land somewhere early in the morning and you fall asleep, and then it creates kind of a different time zone and really not harmony at all. So I think the key is, I mean, I learned from flight attendants and some of the tricks, but equally, you know, you hit the ground running and you let the adrenaline carry you. I mean, Davos, the World Economic Forum there, COP30 and other events coming up, very intense. So you let the adrenaline kind of carry you, and sometimes sleep is optional, but you know, at the end of the week, it's quite fruitful.
How of green real world assets changing the liquidity accessibility?
There is a multi-trillion-dollar annual financing gap. You know, the World Economic Forum puts that at about $4 trillion a year. In reality, it's much, much more. Traditional finance isn't necessarily solving that gap to the extent that it should. And so there's a real opportunity here for accelerated finance from the digital side, because there's big demand on the digital side from cryptocurrencies into mainstream for real world assets. Those real world assets from energy resources, land resources, whether it's forestry and land restoration, to carbon credit sets on the other side of the spectrum and associated with that. And in reality, even mine tailings restoration and everything that comes with that. So I think the beauty here is you're starting to make sustainability economic rather than a cost in its own right. That's also driving kind of sustainable economics and green industrialization, like a lot of the work we do in Africa. And that's actually encouraging a more accelerated move to net zero based on the financing and also the actions as well.
You mentioned carbon markets and going there, what is the most underrated fintech innovation you see and can really improve the transparency of carbon markets?
An excellent question. There are too many vertical silos. Everyone wants to build their own empires, or they think, this is mine, that's yours. The real driver on this is interoperability and interconnectivity, because ultimately we have to break down those silos. Everyone speaks, for example, about blockchain being one ubiquitous technology, but there are many blockchains, both public and private. Equally, traditional finance and application programming interfaces aren't going away anytime soon. So the old world and the new world have to coexist. And the real opportunity there is to bridge those worlds and make it easier to issue assets with underlying provenance, such as carbon credits or other green assets, to make them investable, to then trade them, and then to sell them effectively. And those orchestration technologies, and we're doing that at 013, and there are other networks, and we like to take a network of networks approach. These are key now to really propagate scale in these markets.
Thank you. Talking about investment, how can digital infrastructure help directly these developing markets?
I was in Kenya the day that USAID disbanded, and people don't realize, they just think, aid will go into local community projects and small scale things, but it impacted everything from their national healthcare to those community driven initiatives and projects. And, there was one country I was engaged with in Africa, not to mention the name, but the dearth of USAID caused a $1.2 billion financing gap a year for them. In many ways, that's a blessing and a curse. A curse in that money is no longer there. But what it's encouraging these countries to do is really look at the natural resources and the expertise that they have, and look at how they can harness that, and no longer rely on charity, but rely on economic development, leveraging assets in a fair and equitable manner. This presents a great opportunity, not only for the global South, but also for the global North, because the global North, and in that I'd put the GCC countries as well, not just the Western countries, we're all worried about water, energy, and food security. And post-COVID, that's been ever more a problem that's been exacerbated. Now, that equitable balance allows both the global South and the global North to develop effectively in a fair and equitable fashion. And you're not killing the goose that lays the golden egg, meaning if the global South create that output, global North benefits from it too.
Thank you. In addition, you have spoken at Connected Africa, where the 013 is active. How can real world assets focused fintech help to bridge this gap? And maybe what's policy you see change by COP30 in Brazil?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting because, COP29 in Belém, Article 6 was finally agreed after nearly a decade, which meant an effective route that was better governed for carbon markets. Now, we got ahead of that 1 year before, and then at COP made the announcement of operationalizing Ghana's activity under Article 6 into Singapore, for example. Now, if we look at it, what I don't necessarily like at COPs is these climate pledges in terms of finance are made, and either they're under the much needed amounts annually, or alternatively, some of those pledges never materialize. So I think now taking a model that's equity focused, harnessing both capital from the digital side as well as the traditional side, this is going to lead to an acceleration. So, I'd like to see more adoption of tokenization across some of these organizations. The World Bank and others have looked at it in the past, but not necessarily adopted it. But if you look at UNFCCC, UNDP, even what they do in terms of registries and what they do in terms of some of the methodologies lend themselves well to use of AI, use of blockchain. But that's also going to create more trust and accelerate the adoption of climate finance. So I think really the World Economic Forum last time, all the talk was about technology and climate. And it was really interesting. Recently I took my daughter before she started university to some of the open days. And in the environmental science climate finance lecture at King's, the first thing they spoke about was digital. And therefore, whether it's working with the telecommunication firms, whether it's working with the cloud providers, up the stack at the transaction level, all of this is key to drive this forward.
Thank you. Now, can we find the right balance point for regular oversight in digital assets?
There's no such thing as harmonized digital asset regulations, because if you look, UK's got its own regime, Europe under MICA has its own, and now the good news is the Genius Act in the US will allow increasingly those assets to go mainstream. And of course, in the UAE, the FSRA under Abu Dhabi Global Market have been very active for some time in that sphere. So I think there's never going to be such a thing as harmonized regulations that are exactly the same. It's no different if you look at banking regulations, but what you do start to see is common standards being adopted, common methodologies and common protocols. And I think increasingly we're beginning to see that on the digital asset side, whereas for many a year, the digital asset side and the traditional side didn't mix. And one was deemed to be the Wild West on the digital side, and then the traditional side was wary of it. Now we're seeing increasing adoption from firms like BlackRock to JP Morgan on the one hand, to other sort of fast emerging players, also reducing the barriers to entry, which is then encouraging adoption, which all in all then means there's more tools available to us on the climate side, whether it's climate finance, carbon markets, or wider green asset than there have been ever before. And some of that best practice is being captured under some common standards because we're involved in some of those. For example, connectivity is fostered to send driven order using something called fixed protocol. They're increasingly looking at how that can be used for carbon markets, for example.
What specific climate fintech challenge will be solved in?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting because, at the moment, we seem to be joining up different levels of the ecosystem or its manual. You're increasingly going to see agents as a service that are AI driven drive a lot of this activity. So, for example, one example being project development description takes a long time to create. Project to project, let's say on agroforestry land restoration, there might be a 5% difference and then commonality, 95%. Now, that will be created very, very quickly, which will also lower the time taken to issuance. There's much lower costs to be able to register carbon credits and they're much more fungible on. So we're going to see all of this accelerate. And ultimately, it's something we call alignment of the 7 Cs. So climate has to be aligned with carbon. It has to be aligned with connectivity. It has to be aligned with capital, but also then that has to benefit communities, companies, and countries as well.
Hello and welcome back to the International Climate Webinar Series, African Chapter, third discussion. I am Salima Ibash-Stephen, your host, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's discussion. Hope this interview has already triggered some question within our guest today and you. Today we are here two of the most forces shaping futures, the green transition, transformation. Africa stands at the crossroads to frog traditional development path by merged climate action and age technology. Now let's welcome our three experts who have their insight: Kloof, Garikai, Nhoko, and Sheila Bergen. Mel is international in climate, energy, and development, with over 20 years across Africa and the Arab world, the pioneer across affiliates and universities in Tunisia and Italy. Thank you for joining us, Sheila, Innovation-Driven Market Director at the Digital Corporation, a Kenyan start coach and innovation start. She has over 14 years in Africa tech entrepreneurship. Thank you, and I'm happy to have you again. Gary Kai lead co-develops communication and stakeholder engagement, bringing experience 39 Africans, including all at Smart Africa, work high-level stakeholders. Thank you for joining us today, Gary Kai. Today, to guide this essential session, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Tabitha Muthoni, anchor and producer at CNBS Africa. And Tabitha is a seasoned CNBC Africa journalist and of Closing Bell East Africa and Powerland Africa. With over 10 years, she specialized business reporting economic coverage across Africa. Rita, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, wow, 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 Sheila, what an introduction. And with such kind of an introduction, I don't think there is any more or anything more that I can add to that. So well done. And thank you so much for this session. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third Green Transition and also Digital Transformation webinar hosted by the ICWS African chapter. And as Sheila has put it, my name is, as Salma has put it, my name is Tabitha Muthoni, a financial journalist, anchor, and producer with CNBC Africa. Very good introduction. And yes, it is indeed my pleasure to moderate this timely discussion on how Africa can merge digital innovation with sustainable development. And also, as we have seen from the introduction there. So, Salma, thank you. Thank you again for putting this together. So today, as Salma has rightly put it, we are joined by thought leaders who are driving impact at the intersection of technology, finance, and climate action. So we will explore how digital transformation can fuel the green economy, empower communities at the same time, and also unlock inclusive growth across the continent, because growth is very important. We are talking about digital transformation, green economy. So it is an ecosystem playing out all together. So to dive right in, we are going to start with innovation and policy alignment. And Sheila, I'd like to begin with you because you are an innovation driven market director at Digital Cooperation Organization, that is DCO. You have been very instrumental in advancing innovation driven markets across the Digital Cooperation Organization, connecting multiple countries and ecosystems. So, quite a lot that you're doing in that front. So, to kick off our conversation or the questions here with you, Sheila, maybe we can start by understanding how digital policy frameworks and cross-border cooperation evolve to support Africa's unique green growth agenda. Because I understand without policies, there are no investments, there is no progress, there is no support to the economy. So Sheila, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And this is a very, very important conversation I think that we're having. I'd just like to delve into the policy, digital policy framework, and why it's important to have cross-border cooperation, especially in Africa. I think digital policy and cross-border cooperation is critical, and it needs to move beyond connectivity. I think policies have to become enablers of both circular and low carbon economies, and this will allow the countries, one, to build their local capacities, but two, to leverage a strength of other countries across the region. I think the other thing to also note is harmonization. I think it's critical for harmonization of regulations across regions. So yes, that is quite important. The last thing, I think there are so many things we can talk about, data centers and whatnot, but I think the most important thing is to ensure that citizens are aware about the green transition, and governments can promote green by design standards, either for local manufacturing but also for imports that they are bringing into the country. This, I think, will ultimately have a long-term effect on the standardization of policies, but I think it will also allow for implementation of cross-border certification and standards that incentivize either if it's energy efficient devices, if it's modular design.
All right.
Those things.
Yes, Sheila, very important pointers that you draw across, but we are having a bit of an issue with your mic. Maybe you can try fix that. Maybe use a headset if you have one. So as we try to get back to Sheila, let us move to Amel. Amel, there's so much looking at your experience here that spans climate policy and finance across global and regional institutions. This is a very critical perspective as Africa looks to scale its green ambition. So as we try try to get across to Sheila. Amel, let us jump over to you, and maybe we can start by the outlook for climate finance in Africa, and also how digital tools can help enhance transparency, and also the aspect of blended finance when it comes to supporting green transition projects while building human capital. Amel, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tabitha. That's an essential question, really, for Africa. So let me start by saying that what you know already, that Africa is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change in the world, facing unequal impacts despite contributing minimally to global emission in the world. And at the same time, Africa is facing an extensive gap in climate finance and requires an estimated 3 trillion US dollar by 2030 in order to be able to implement its climate goals and sustainable development goals. So I would like to talk about the first part of your question, the outlook for climate finance in Africa. For example, private investment remains low in Africa. Currently, it's about only 14% of the total climate finance in the continent in Africa. This is partly owing to perceived risk and the need for smaller investment sizes. There is also some growth. There is some growth in specific area. For example, there are more opportunities in renewable energy financing, green bonds, and PPP, public-private partnership. Actually, most of the climate finance rely on debt, mainly for adaptation. And you know that adaptation is very important for climate change, and especially in Africa. This raises concerns about fiscal sustainability, which gives high debt levels. Also, there is a need for a shift for more concessional financing, blended finance, and you mentioned that in your question, and international cooperation to close the gap. Digital transformation, so, is really the solution for this gap. Digital tools can enhance exactly, that's what you said, Tabitha, transparency by improving data access, tracking funds, and creating platforms for investor visibility, which can help build trust and attract more capital for both adaptation and mitigation projects. Again, about transparency, digital tools can enhance transparency by, for example, improving data and information. So this can be possible through digital platforms that can make climate projects more visible to investors. Also, by enhancing accountability. This is very important also in the African regions, all the countries. So digital tools can track financial flows and project outcomes more effectively, allowing a greater accountability to both local and also international donors.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
yes, Amel.
so,
Let me cut you short before you move on to your next point. Did you mean $3 million US dollars, or is it $3 billion US dollars by 2030?
3 trillions, trillions, 3
$3
billions.
trillion.
Yes, it's a huge amount. Yeah.
Yes, that's quite a huge number. So from where you sit, how realistically achievable is this figure by 2030? And also, what can we do? What can governments and even multilateral institutions do to realize this figure, to achieve this figure by 2030?
Well, I don't want to be, I'm optimistic, but let's say by 2030, it seems very difficult to reach this huge amount. However, for African region, there are some reforms that can be done because, in fact, there are many possibilities with the private sector, for example. There is a huge potential in Africa. So, of course, we rely on international donors, but a special focus has to be given to the private sector in Africa within the countries. So for this, we need several several reforms, of course. Shall I mention some reforms, maybe?
Yes, please go ahead, because then actually that point actually trickles into the next question, which is the top reforms that are needed by regional bodies such as FDB to attract more private and climate funds. And actually the main question is, are multilateral institutions actually adapting fast enough? So yes, please proceed, Amel.
Yes. Okay, we may say that multilateral institutions adaptation is quite slow for Africa. Actually, this is due to several reasons. So I have mentioned the reasons in the first part of the question, the outlook of climate in Africa. However, with the reforms that I'm going to mention, maybe we can reach more or less this amount. So reforms regarding the regulatory and legislative environment. Political will, this is very important, and strategies has to be done for private sector, especially for private sector. This could be achieved through reform that address private sector concerns, I mean needs, but this has to be, carefully done according to the needs of each country in Africa. Also, the development of climate-related legislation. We need to have an accurate legislation, such as regulation concerning energy audit requirements, for example, as well as feed and tariffs. This will promote private sector investment in climate and green transition. Other reforms for currency convertibility and availability. This is a very big problem in Africa, the currency, issue. So the nationalization and expropriation of assets by defining national development plans. So huge work needs to be done by central banks and so on, with, of course, international and financing institutions. Reforms also regarding credit enhancement. As part of blended finance approach, private sector climate finance can be further accelerated through the provision of concessional finance in the form of credit enhancement mechanism. I want to remind that credit enhancement mechanism can be provided by entities that provide concessional finance, like GFIs, governments, and multilateral and regional agencies. I mean, if these reforms are generalized to all African countries, we can be very optimistic and reach this huge volume needed by African countries.
Yeah. Indeed, Amel, quite insightful details that you raised there on climate finance and development. So thank you so much. Maybe we can get back to Sheila. Sheila, you're raising very important pointers there on how digital policy frameworks and cross-border cooperation can evolve to support Africa's unique green growth agenda. And just retracting to what Amel has said, development is very important. Funding, the role of multilateral institutions is very important. The private sector and also the government coming together, it's very important. But we do understand that government cannot come together, multilateral institutions cannot come together if we do not have the right policies in place, rather. So Sheila, maybe take us through again on some of the digital policy frameworks that are needed to support Africa's unique, let's call it unique green growth agenda, because it is indeed unique.
Sheila, sorry, Tabitha, Sheila, she's disconnected. Maybe we have to move with the Kaikai and give him to
All right.
give a
No, absolutely.
All right,
But Tabitha, I'd be happy to tackle that question. Just I think to tie up what how the discussion I think initially went. I think ideally we need to be thinking about the green transition not just as a climate question, but ideally this needs to be a complete economic transformation, which is where technology comes in to be able to drive that transformation. So we need to be thinking about how Africa grows, how Africa powers itself, how Africa feeds itself, and industrializes sustainably. So if we are looking at it in a holistic perspective, regulation cannot only touch climate or cannot only touch technology. What needs to happen is the regulation needs to be holistic. We need to take a look at it as a whole of system approach. to say that we are touching multiple elements. And then for us to be able to succeed and go forward, we need to be cognizant of all the elements across the entire ecosystem, whether it's coming from industrialization to how we feed ourselves and so on, and not silo it as purely a climate sort of question. And I think this would be a uniquely African approach in terms of taking a look at green transition and digital transformation.
Yes, Garikai, thank you. Maybe Amel, you'd like to add something on blended finance here.
Sorry, I don't know if I'm muted or... Yeah, it's okay. Yes, yes. I like to say something about blended finance because I didn't reply to this question. It was your first question, I think. So because this is very, very important, again, for African region. So blended finance, it combines public and private capital and can support green transition projects while building on human capital in several ways. So how it's through de-risking investment, for example, enhancing sustainability. For example, public or philanthropic capital in blended finance can mitigate risks for private sector, attracting funding for projects aligned with climate goals and sustainable development goals in Africa. Also through capacity building and technical assistance, because blended finance can include technical assistance components. This is very important, often as grant-like resources for project preparation, for example, feasibility studies to ensure project quality, efficiency, and sustainability. Also, by building resilience and equity, investments in human capital, particularly through policies that promote health, water, agriculture reforms. These can foster climate-smart food systems and nutrition support, which is very important, again, for our continent, African region, which are fundamental to strengthen human capital. So I wanted to mention this because I think it's very important for climate finance in Africa. Thanks.
Indeed, thank you, Amel. Maybe just to recap on what we are talking about, digital policy frameworks, very important. Garika, you've shared some key pointers there, saying that it is an ecosystem. Everyone has a role to play here. You know, the governments, the startups, collaboration, and also the financiers, you know, climate finance and development at the same time. But I am keen on some of the partnerships that you are seeing emerge around clean tech or circular economy models in Africa. Maybe, Garikai, some thought-provoking insights on that.
Absolutely. I think what we've started to see are partnerships that I think transcend that digital green nexus. And what you begin to see are the more successful partnerships that we have are the less conventional ones that are able to bring in sort of revenues. For example, within the space that I actively work in, where we consider digital public infrastructure. And when you're talking about digital public infrastructure, you're taking a look at digital ID systems, digital payment systems, and data exchange platforms. What's happening now is that people are now taking a look at it not as a purely finance and execution transaction, but trying to see how the ecosystem can play in between and be able to contribute in their own way. So for example, what then happens with DPI is when you then have the digital payments in place, you begin to make green payments more transparent. When you have green payments more transparent, that builds trust. When that builds trust, that attracts additional investors. And so you begin to realize that it's more a multiple chain sort of approach as you continue to go forward. And then you also then find other technologists who are now coming with additional solutions beyond finance. For example, those who are focusing on IoT or satellite data, which I'm sure you're aware Africa needs a lot of. And they're using this to try to see how we monitor things like deforestation, manage water, predict weather, and elements like that. And so we're making this green transition more possible through multi-layered ecosystem partnerships that then begin to create the trust element, the transparency element, which then begin to attract even the financiers in. And so we've even seen cities twin with each other in order to share information, to share experiences, peer learning, best practice learning, so that we're not reinventing the wheel. And so this whole of ecosystem approach towards green transition and digital transformation, and merging that nexus between that particular transformation and the green transition is important in terms of just ensuring that we are moving forward. Africa is doing it at its own terms, and Africa is also doing it in a way which is sustainable for the African continent. Exciting times, Tabitha.
Indeed, indeed. And actually, there's a lot when it comes to attracting financials, because then the aspect of how we communicate, the aspect of how we position ourselves, they say PR, public relations, how you sell your story or how you sell yourself as a continent is very important. And the big question here is how development organizations can better communicate impact to attract rather private capital. So let me rephrase it this way. How best can we position ourselves to attract private capital? The aspect of communication is very important here. So Gary Kai, I'd like you to take that one.
Thanks, Tabitha. I think you took the words right out of my mouth. I think one of the challenges that we've faced in the past is that communication has been an afterthought. And what we're realizing now is that it needs to be a strategic and intentional part of how we communicate. I think the reality of it is that when you tell a story, it becomes the bridge between data existing and a decision being made. And what we need are more decisions to be made. So now we need to turn these numbers into human choices. And so if, for example, we are attracting investors, if these investors can see concrete lives being changed, scalable models being developed on the African continent, measurable returns, we'll be able to move capital so much faster than even the need for that capital. But it means we need to be telling the right story and telling it in the right way. What this means is now we need to be able to merge the data with the correct sort of narrative that we have. And we need to be able to demonstrate good proof points that then begin to attract a lot more investors towards this. And also just making sure that we've got strong investment case narratives. The reality of it is that any investment is made on the strength of a good narrative. And in Africa, we haven't been telling our stories enough. If we begin to invest a bit more in being able to tell these stories, we become a lot more attractive to those investors. And so we begin to take a look at ways in which we can do that. I think the sum of it all is that you don't just tell an investor what a project does or how it scales, but the idea is you also tell them what's in it for them. And then where capital sees impact and return, capital will come. So the storytelling is important even for the capital, the 3 trillion that Emma was talking about.
Yes, indeed, Gary Kai. So, and I think the main question here is Africa doing enough to tell its own green innovation stories globally? Are we doing enough? Are we telling our stories enough? And I think this is a question maybe our audience would maybe share their insights and also perspectives on where we are at in terms of telling our own story as Africans, as the origins, as the original authors or owners of our own stories. So just across sectors, I'd like to post this to Amel. Looking at your work, what communication approach do you think can help balance the immediate energy needs with long-term climate goals across Africa?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this question. Communication is a very, very big issue. I think actually, let's say that public institutions and also private institutions are doing a lot for communication. But I like to say something, this maybe could be a message. In fact, it's not just about disseminating information or about technology innovation, or of course this is very important, but I like to say that it's about engagement. It's about persuading, it's about sensitizing, it's about convincing and mobilizing action. I think the key has been to translate complex climate data, because we talk about climate data and transition, green transition, into accessible information. So we need to get the information so the people can understand it and can hear it. I mean, can focus on this information about compelling narrative that resonate with diverse audiences. This is, I think, the important issue, because, of course, actually, we manipulate very well technologies, but it's about engagement, as I say. It's about, I mean, how can I say, but reaching all the audiences, all the populations. I mean, that's I think most important, I think, for communication.
Yes, engagement and mobilization is very important, I hear. So, Garika, maybe you can add a little bit more on that, because mobilizing support for sustainability, that's very instrumental at the same time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, just to add to what Amal said, it's also about building trust. How we're able to package the work that we're doing is also a trust building exercise, and being able to give meaning to complex things and make it relevant to people, I think, is in itself a very, very important skill. You know, when you take a look at African innovators, I was just yesterday at an innovation conference in Nairobi, and you realize that African innovators are producing enormous solutions, even across the green transition. But we adopt a defensive narrative, and it could be a trust question, it could be a confidence question, or it could be a communication skills question. But ultimately, what we need to do is to be a bit bolder as we go out. I think we need to be able to be bold enough to tap into our strengths. And one of our biggest strengths is strong grassroots solutions, young founders, and abundant natural resources. We need to be able to stand proudly and be able to communicate that, not from a defensive position, but from a more confident position. It's my conviction that if we're able to communicate these elements well, we begin to attract the right type of investment. And in addition to the right type of investment, we begin to attract the right types of partners who enable us to move forward. So yeah, I think there's a bit of work to be done there, but I think we've got the right foundation to get started.
Indeed, Garika. So what I'm getting from this is policies, trust, available data. All of this is very important when it comes to capitalizing on the return on investment, which is very critical. All right. So as we ponder on that, and if anyone, Amel, Garika, if you have got anything else to add, we can look into that before, or as we try to get some questions from our audience. Salma. Sheila, Salma, very close names. So Salma, you can help coordinate some of the audience questions coming in. So as we try to coordinate that, maybe Amel, Garikai, maybe your thoughts on especially capitalizing on the data here, which is very important, or return on investment.
Shall I?
Garika, you can go.
Oh, all right. I was going to say ladies first, being the gentleman that I am. But no worries. I think I'll definitely jump in. I think there are multiple questions that we need to answer. We've got a global view in terms of what needs to be done, especially on the financing side and elements like that. But when we go granular, I think we need to take a look at it in terms of also making sure that this green transition is just and inclusive. So as it happens, we also need to make sure that who are we leaving out? Are we making sure that it's inclusive to women and children as well? Are we ensuring that workers, especially those who may be less skilled, also have access to benefit from these green jobs and technologies? So the questions then drill further, just beyond the access to these funds. Even once we get the transition right, is it serving our people in the way in which it should? And this becomes one question that I think would need to ask, and I'd love to perhaps get a sense from even the audience in terms of that. The last thing I'll talk about is more or less these green financing and carbon markets that have been heralded quite a bit, in that we also need to make sure that these are accessible to local entrepreneurs, and make sure that they're transparent in terms of how these are doled out. I think ideally, the whole message that I'm delivering here is about inclusion, making sure that those within the ecosystem are not left out, even as we finance it and succeed to move through it. I'll pause there.
All right, Gary Kai, all right, trying to see any questions from our audience. All right, we can jump quickly. Do you have any questions? Okay, Mohand Dobari saying, what about energy and connectivity in Africa to go digital? All right, before we respond to that question, maybe Amel, you can just recap on some of the good examples that we are seeing on countries in Africa that have succeeded in terms of attracting funds, very briefly. And actually, Amel, I think that's a question that you can take. It's in relation to your field.
Okay.
Yeah, you can tie those two together.
Yes. Let's see question. So
it's about energy. What about energy and connectivity in Africa in terms of going digital? That actually relates to the point of African countries, or examples of successes that we are seeing in terms of African countries attracting funds. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I think we've been talking about climate outcomes, about issues, problems related, barriers related to climate finance, and so on. But I'm very optimistic about what's happening in the African countries, all African countries, South, North, and Western, West Africa, East. Because in fact we are I'm among some commissions to select projects and startups, and Africans are really very dynamic, and I'm very much involved to create startups. The good thing is that these startups, we are talking about energy, of course, it's about renewable energy or energy efficiency startups to access to clean energy and so on, for several thematics like transport, like electric production, electricity, etc. So we see now that there is, a very nice results on this. I like to mention some examples of successful example. For example, some countries could attract funds recently. So, for example, I can mention Sao Tome and Principe that approved about 9 grants for agriculture and fisheries sectors to combat shocks on. This is very recent, October 7, 2025. We approved this last week. This is very important subject, because Sao Tome, they could, express their needs through a bankable project. This is very important. Again, Niger signed about 160 million agreement for energy access, competitiveness, and resilience on recently, also October 2, 2025. Mozambique approved 23 million grant for rice production and climate resilience. It was in September 30. And so for example, there are very good work in preparation actually by several countries. It's going to be presented on COP 30. I think it's going to be next month. So Africa, I want to say that Africa is actively working towards advancing a unified vision and voice for climate action on the global stage. This is very optimistic, really.
Indeed. So there are actually some examples that Africa can learn from, looking at the case studies that Amel has laid out there, from Mozambique by September 30th and other countries. So I think the question was on how, in terms of where we are at in going digitally, as a continent? Where are we at in terms of that? And also quite a number of factors come into play here. You know, what we have actually stated, policies, trust, very important when it comes to developing our startups, and also available data or capitalizing on data, which is very important for any investor that wants to invest in the continent. So the next question is from Faiza Tamara, and she asks, how are African countries progressing in terms of interconnection and collaboration? A very important question. Garikai, the way we shape our stories is very important. So I'd like to pose that question to you.
Absolutely, and I hope I'll shape it well. I think Africa is more intentional now about collaboration and cooperation, not just across the green transition or digital transformation, but across everywhere. Now, we'll talk about a number of initiatives that are taking place. You take a look, for example, at the Smart Africa Alliance, you're looking at 41 countries that have come together and said, how can we work together to make digital transformation happen in a unified way across the continent? How do we harmonize regulation? How do we ensure there's the right political will? And so you've got bodies like that. Most recently, we're working with the Southern African Development Community to use technology to be able to ensure that businesses can begin to transact across the continent. We also have the AFCFTA, which is trying to make sure that we are able to move our goods across the continent. So there's intentionality, there is progress, and there is work that's taking place across Africa in terms of being able to integrate and engage. Technology is at the center of all of this because it's an enabler. So it enables us to make the right decisions. It also enables us to be able to take the right paths to leapfrog. And then that then brings in the green transition that enables us to share knowledge and to be able to engage and exchange. Tabitha, I think the bottom line is that Africa is on the right track. There's the right political will, there are the right regulatory frameworks. The idea now is to be able to just move forward and to be able to fund our own green transition and digital transformation.
Indeed, funding our own, that's very important, because looking at AGOA, it has already expired. We are in October, mid-October. Do we have anything new? Still a discussion for another day. And also now capitalizing on the blocks that we have. We have COMESA, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we did see actually Ethiopia start shipping its goods to Kenya. That's tea, coffee, via ports, via air. You know, it's a very important time for Africa to look inwards and look at, oh, okay, this is the problem that we do have. So what solutions can we come up with? And just a good example is Rwanda. Rwanda, there's a story that came out today. They're starting to manufacture their own products. I'm not sure if I do have the right kind of products that they're trying to manufacture, which actually it starts today. So actually, with all these global events that are taking place, they're actually shaping how Africa moves next, because we do have the right raw materials, but the issue is then how do we produce our own internally? Because I believe Africa has everything it takes to be the next frontier when it comes to feeding the entire world. Because if we could capitalize on agriculture, our own raw materials, then we are going to be on the front line competing with everyone else. We are no longer going to be, relying on aid from outside. So I believe Africa has what it takes to fund itself and feed itself at the same time. Funding and feeding, very important. If we feed ourselves, if we fund ourselves, then we do not need external aid. All right, the next question, if you do have the next question from our audience. That's Silla Heber, and the question is, did digitalization help rural communities? Or the question is, how has digitalization helped rural communities? Share a real story. Any success stories that we have seen so far in terms of digitalization helping the rural communities? Mm-hmm.
So it's for me, yeah, the question?
Sure, go ahead, Amel. The floor is open to everyone now.
Thank you. Yes, there are many, successful examples. For example, I mean, we see actually the platforms creation in several countries, and there is connection also between these. For sometimes the platform is shared between several countries. I can mention platform, I mean, it's for and sustainable mobility. The platform aims to transform urban transportation in Senegal by promoting clean, for example, through electrical vehicle adoption. It's in partnership with several other countries and other sector in Senegal. The initiative targets to reduce, of course. So this fits also with the goals, the climate goals, and is a national determined contribution to reduce emissions, and it's actually a very nice, good example that could be analyzed to other countries. What can I say? Also, Tanzania is building a platform on low-income earners for agriculture, and especially women and youth. So they are, I mean, this platform assist, support women and youth to create their own, I mean, own business is business really related to the years of their villages, of their, and this is also very good success platform. They are supported by Bank in Tanzania. It's very good example of public-private partnership. Well, there are many other, for example, South Africa also. We can many examples in South Africa, very successful energy also to inform the use sharpen to clean energy, for example. So there's a black cities, I mean, make an adequate transition for energy consumption. That's these are some examples, actually.
Yeah. Real life examples are there, Amel. So maybe Garikai, you can add something on that and also tie that with the issue of carbon credits. We keep talking about carbon credits, but do we understand what carbon credits are? Where are we at on that? So let us in on how tokenized carbon credits or digital assets could transform Africa's green financing landscape, and then we can have our final thoughts and key messages.
Absolutely. If I can first just chime in on the rural areas, you know, we talk about one of Africa's biggest benefits being our demographic dividend, that we have a lot of young people and they continue to innovate. What's become most interesting is that these young people have changed the anatomy of what a rural area is. And so you begin to see that instead of what a rural area was in the past, which was more or less a sink, which would then receive from an urban area, what generally happens is now rural areas are areas of production. And with these areas of production now taking place, we now then see that there's a lot happening. So with satellite technology, we now find that the rural areas are now producing. They now have innovation. They now have a lot of production that's taking place, whether it's through climate smart agriculture, whether it's actually through actual innovation. And so the short answer to the question is yes. You find that there's a lot of technology is improving a lot that's happening in rural areas. Then we talk about the carbon credits. I think carbon credits are a good way for us to be, or the carbon markets are a good way for us to be able to finance our digital transformation and our green transition. And what needs to happen now is we need to build trust around that so that it's not the preserve of just a few. So we've been working on the best possible ways to be able to build trust around that and to ensure that it becomes a lot more inclusive, younger entrepreneurs, that it's more transparent in terms of how these funds are, and also in terms of how the land is either sold or leased, to make sure that we're not prejudicing underprivileged communities. So there's a benefit to it, but there's an element of caution that needs to be managed, just to make sure that we've got things happening in the right way. So a lot to unpack, but I think certainly movement in the right direction.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you, Garikai. Thank you, Amel. So if you can take one more or final question from our audience that have been with us from the start until now. All right, Matthias Dobini. So moving goods in Africa, but what about moving innovations? Very timely question. Thank you, Matthias. Who'd like to take that? Amel?
Sorry, I didn't
Yes.
hear well the question. Can you repeat, please?
So we are moving goods in Africa, within Africa, but how do we move innovations? How possible is that, or how feasible is that?
Well, I think it's innovation is here, is in Africa. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, we are really impressed by the work done by the African youth, because through the creation of startups and which is, I mean, for me, innovation is when you innovate by using your local capacities, and this is being done in African countries, in many African countries. So innovation is there. However, we have mentioned reforms because, in fact, in order to give the possibility to youth to innovate through existing technologies that they manipulate very well, you need to make reforms on the legislation to allow, I mean, the private sector to invest in this sector. The climate change, renewable energy, energy efficiency, etc. And this is, I mean, this is a very important key for Africa in order to innovate more and to give the possibility to for youth to innovate. I want to say also that the future is very promising, because I like to inform you that for the first time, renewable energy has generated more power than coal. This is the first time since 30 years that the climate change convention exists. The clean energy future is no longer a distant promise. It's really here. We can say that it's here, including in Africa. For example, solar and wind, which is very good potential. We have in Africa very good potential of solar and wind, as you know, are now the cheapest sources of power. And clean energy sectors are creating jobs, business, boosting growth and driving progress. So I think it's very promising for the African region to invest, to innovate in renewable energy and what we call green transition. That's what I want to say. Maybe it's, well,
Yes, indeed. That's a very important, because we are also seeing key stakeholders in terms of promoting inclusive data governance. You have the likes of UNESCO, the African Union, and even Smart Africa. We do see that they convened consultations with some key African stakeholders to promote inclusive data governance. We did see a regional consultation take place. They were aiming at looking at challenges and opportunities when it comes to shaping a rights-based and inclusive data governance framework, which is very important. So as much as we are moving goods, we do see a frontier when it comes to moving innovations with the right governance or data governance in place, because innovation and data, they worked hand in hand. So very important. Maybe Garikai, you can add something on that.
Absolutely. I think, look, in my view, innovations and ideas are easier to move than people and goods. I think you can move ideas with the strength of a phone call, or and email communication. And so I think as we connect Africa, we are empowering people to be able to exchange ideas and to share them and to export them. I think what we then need to do to make sure that this is meaningful is for them to be able to monetize them across places that are beyond their borders. And so this is where we need the right policy frameworks. We need the right regulatory frameworks that our ideas can be seen as valuable as goods and can then be monetized. If Tabitha, I bring my ideas from Zimbabwe to Rwanda, hopefully I can be able to earn from them. And I think that's one way to be able to look at it. So I think the strength of ideas comes through our strength to be able to collaborate, our strength to be able to connect, and to be able to move voice and ideas and text across multiple platforms. That means connectivity becomes important. Cost of connectivity also becomes critically important, and the ability of people to put their hands on devices that enable them to connect with people across the continent.
Indeed. And also ensuring seamless harmonization when we are connecting when it comes to innovations. That's very important. I understand it's still a work in progress when it comes to harmonization across different, regulations or jurisdictions, but it's still we have made some strides in that stance. So maybe some final thoughts and key messages here. We have covered quite a lot in our conversation today. So let us look at come 2026, the one significant thing or change that you foresee coming to your industry and even region. Amel.
Yeah, well, maybe a final message. We talk a lot about climate finance, innovation, and so on. And I said that we have everything to be innovative in Africa and to really make a difference and an added value, not only in Africa, but to the whole world. However, we need maybe a message, if you allow me. We need to be innovative in terms of opportunity for all. For example, I think our countries must invest in stronger, social involvement, social protection. So, for example, young people, women, workers, and indigenous people and others can thrive in the new energy economy, because energy needs to be not only accessible for all, but everyone can make business from energy and create jobs and what we call green jobs. We also need a greater regional cooperation, which means South-South cooperation, interconnection between all, the regions of Africa, North, South, East, West, as I said, to support low-income countries that remain heavily dependent on fossil fuels. I think this is the message that I want to say by now. Thanks.
Indeed, quite a number of great insights there. So, Garikai, in your industry, what's going to be the next game changer?
I'm a believer in people, and I kind of think everything that we do has to lead to people. So the reality of it is that we're standing, I think, probably at the center of two revolutions, the digital and the green. And then what we need to do is to make sure that these meet in the service of people and not in the shadow of profit. So the idea is, let's turn innovation into inclusion, and let's turn transition into transformation. So for Africa, the green transition won't be about catching up, but I think leapfrogging, and leapfrogging is a big term. So we have the sun, we have the youth, we have ingenuity. Let's design a future that works for everyone. So for me, the idea is always, let's place people at the center of what we're doing. Whether it's technology, whether it's green, it has to be in the service of people.
Indeed. And I think I can say for me, it's PR. How you shape your narrative is very important. Case study, the American dream, very well packaged, but how many have lived it? So let's create our own. Market Africa, how would want to be perceived to the outside world. So just one final remark, key takeaway, what stood out for you, or what has stood out for you today? Amel.
What is, sorry?
What has stood out for you today? One key message that
One
has
key
really stood out
message.
for you.
Yeah, the key
Yes.
message, I think I said already, but the key message for Africa is really to cooperate inside Africa. We have all the possibilities.
Cooperation.
Yes, cooperation, South-South cooperation.
Indeed,
And as
cooperation.
said, lead to put human in the central, to focus on human. Human is the capital. There is nothing else. So
All right.
if we open cooperation between our countries, which actually we can say that there is a cooperation, but it's not enough. So we need really to work on this, to cooperate between us, South-South, North, of course, but I mean, cooperation, South-South cooperation is very important,
Yes.
actually.
In.
Yeah.
All right, indeed, Amel. Thank you so much. And just sincere apologies from Sheila Bergen, our one of our speakers who had some difficulties, technical hitches, could not make it to the end. But from our earlier discussions with her, she was very keen on resilience when it comes to innovation-driven markets across multiple countries and ecosystems, or connecting multiple countries and ecosystems. All right, so resilience is what she was keen on when it comes to Africa's unique green growth agenda, and also collaboration between governments and startups. Very briefly, Garikai, what's your word for the day?
Thank you. I really loved Sheila's and Amel's. For me, I think all I'll say is that we'll only succeed when sustainability becomes, I think, a story that we all share. So powered by innovation, told through data, and then driven by people.
Spot on. All right. Without further ado, without adding or removing anything into our conversations today, which have been very instrumental in understanding Africa's green growth agenda, where are we headed? I would like to say thank you very much for all your input, and also our audience, very timely, invigorating questions that are shaping our African story. So I'd like to pass over the mic or the floor to Salma Steven.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salma. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you to all. Thank you for time. Thank you for being with us all together despite your schedule. You are moving all. You are expert busy with your busy schedule. Thank you for joining. I want to say also thank you to our attendees, and I appreciated also having this interview with here and there of digital fintech, to have the dates and be notified about our coming discussion to continue on Africa, Europe, and North America. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and get the information on time. Thank you for your time, our guest. I'm pleased having you today, and I wish for all a good health and a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.